Flying Pokemon can be tricky Pokemon to keep and handle. In many ways, they're the ones that need the most training while young, as a lot of the final evolutions are so large, housing them can become impractical without a large amount of space and resources. The Pidgey line is actually a good example of this, with there being such a massive gulf in size between the first and the final form. Welcome everyone to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go over how to keep and house Pokemon in your own home. For those who are unfamiliar with the Pokemon, Pidgey and its following evolutions are common flying types from the Kanto region. So common that, along with the Spearow line, they're often Kantonian trainers' first interaction with a flying type Pokemon. Pidgey is a small bird Pokemon, brown feathers on its back and pale yellow feathers on its stomach, weighing only about 4 pounds on average and standing only a foot tall. Its evolution, Pidgeotto, kicks it up a bit, standing 3.5 feet tall and an average of 66 pounds. The coloration stays the same as its previous evolution, except it now has red and yellow tail feathers, as well as red feathers on its head, looking almost like it's got some hair. As a Pidgeot, those feathers on its head grow much longer and gain a yellow streak down the center. At this point, it's pretty much a bird with long hair. A big bird, too. Pidgeot stand nearly 5 feet tall and weigh over 87 pounds, so they can get quite large towards the end. Large enough that training becomes paramount for their care. But you'll hear all about that later on in the guide. For now, let's go through and see if the Kanto region's most well-known bird line is the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Enclosure. As I'm sure many of you have guessed, the biggest thing for a bird Pokemon's enclosure is going to be space. And not just ground space, you need vertical space as well. These Pokemon need to be able to fly as a big part of their exercise and development. Without it, mental and physical issues can arise. Which leaves two options when building the enclosure. You can encase the entire thing, all the space your Pokemon would need to fly around to be properly taken care of. That's a good method for smaller Pokemon, maybe, but for a lot of the bird Pokemon, especially the later evolutions, it's just not possible. For Pokemon like Pidgeot, you'd be encasing spaces nearly full city blocks in size and multiple stories tall. The only places that could build an aviary like that are zoos, so we're going to be doing more of what we did for the Beedrill and Butterfree line. Building a small space that the Pokemon can use as their home, and then allowing them to just roam the surrounding area. Starting off, Pidgey is, luckily, a small enough bird that it isn't hard to get an enclosure for it. The first thing that you're going to need is the crate, or the cage. You can order good ones online or find some in any Pokemon supply store, but when looking for a good cage for your bird Pokemon, it's a good rule of thumb to keep in mind for the size that it should be at least 1.5 times the wingspan of the Pokemon that's going to be inside, thus allowing the Pokemon ample space to move around. For a Pidgey, that means you'll need a crate that is at least 4.5 feet in all directions. Obviously, not enough room for it to fly around, but plenty of room for them to stretch their wings and hop around. This enclosure is really just going to be their nesting spot. Speaking of flying space though, I would suggest letting them fly around a room of your house. I know, the idea of having a bird loose in your home isn't really that appealing to most people, but the reason is twofold. One is that it provides a safe area for your Pokemon to fly around and explore while they're still young. Two is that it provides a good space for you to work on bonding with and training your Pidgey. We'll get into the training later on in this guide, but for now, I will say that you'll need to train your Pidgey to come back to you when called, because later on, you'll need to recall the later evolutions. But yes, technically, your Pidgey's enclosure will not just be the cage that it stays in, but also the room that the cage is in as well. As for decorations, you can decorate the room however you want, after all, it's your room in your house. Just keep in mind that you're going to have a small bird roaming the room, so I wouldn't put anything small and breakable in there, or anything that you would hate to get messy. Inside the enclosure, I would put a few branches that stretch from one side to the other, acting as perches. You'll also need a water feeder, one of the ones that hangs from the side of the enclosure and has a small dish at the bottom that Pidgey can drink from. It's better to get the ones that hang from the side of the enclosure because it'll avoid collecting all of the things that a ground-based water dish would collect, like fallen feathers, old food, and waste. With Pidgeot and Pidgeotto, their enclosures are radically different from Pidgey's, but they are so similar to each other that it's almost no difference between their enclosure requirements. Let's start with the fact that their enclosures are going to be much larger than Pidgey's. The method that I used above is really designed for smaller birds, but for larger birds like Pidgeotto and Pidgeot, the formula kind of breaks down and tends to produce enclosures that are way too small for the Pokemon inside. So instead, I'm going to recommend that you build an enclosure that's 25 feet wide, 25 feet long, and 20 feet high. That'll give your Pokemon plenty of room to not only stretch their wings, but also flit around the enclosure a little. Yes, technically Pidgeotto could do with a smaller enclosure than that, but the difference between the enclosure for a Pidgeotto and an enclosure for a Pidgeot is so small, it might as well be non-existent. It'll end up being cheaper in the long run for you to just build the Pidgeot enclosure right away, because then you won't have to replace it when your Pokemon evolves. Besides, it's not like your Pidgeotto is going to complain that it has some extra room to fly around. Now, you won't really be able to find these kinds of enclosures for sale in stores or online, at least not often. Usually what you'll have to do is call a company, and then that company will come into your land and build the enclosure to the exact specifications that are needed. They will even include the internal decorations, such as perches, logs, and a nesting box that your Pokemon can use for sleep or to escape the weather. But this is where the training will come in, because as they have been moved outside, that means that they'll need to be let out into the wild to get their exercise in. At this point, if you haven't created that bond between the two of you and spent some time working and training your Pokemon, then one of two things is going to happen. Either the very first time you go to let your Pidgeotto or Pidgeot out, it's going to fly off into the wild and you'll never see it again. Or it will come back, but it will not allow you into the enclosure with it, pecking, scratching, and flapping at you until you leave. And trust me, that can hurt quite a bit when a fully evolved Pokemon uses Steel Wing on you. Something to keep in mind is that all of these specifications are for one Pokemon. Trying to fit more than one Pidgeevolution in the above enclosure size would make the space way too small. That being said, let's go over the Pokemon that could be housed with, or at least in the same territory as your Pidgeevolution. To be honest, there aren't many, and it's mostly because of the predatory nature of this line. Pidgey will usually only go after small bug Pokemon like Wurmple or Caterpie. After all, it's not that big of a Pokemon itself. But that list of prey really expands when it evolves into a Pidgeotto and definitely into a Pidgeot. Fish like Magikarp and Finian, small mammals like Rattata, most bug Pokemon, even fully evolved ones, even Pokemon of types that are strong against flying types like Pikachu and Joltik could become prey to these Pokemon. Anything small enough that a Pidgeotto or a Pidgeot would feel confident attacking and could make a meal out of is on the menu. And speaking of the types that are strong against them, you should avoid mixing them as much as possible, so avoid the rock types, the electric types, and the ice types. They can cause some serious damage to your Pokemon if they're strong enough. Really, the best types to keep with your Pidgey are steel types. They tend to be slow, tough, and Pidgeot don't like to eat metal. You just need to be careful that your steel type is not also a type that can hurt or can be hurt by a flying type. Availability. Earlier, I said that the Pidgey line is usually the first interaction with a flying type Pokemon that Cantonian trainers have experience with, but there is a bit of subtext there that I didn't get into. Most Cantonian trainers have experience with the Pidgey line, but it's usually just with Pidgey itself. Excluding trainer Pokemon, as there's almost no way to accurately estimate how many of those there are, the majority of this line in the wild are just Pidgey. Pidgeotto are uncommon in the wild, and Pidgeot even more so. There are a few reasons behind this, such as predation while young, trainers catching the stronger evolutions, and a big one is competition. While not as much as Pidgey, the two later evolutions are very territorial, and unless they're a mated pair, will fiercely defend their territory from Pokemon that they consider competition, especially others of the same species. This fierce competition between the upper evolutions leads to them being more spread out and can lead to injury. This same difference in rarity between the evolutions has also appeared in the breeding trade as well, as it's just easier to raise a colony of Pidgey together with Everstones, instead of the space-intensive, training-intensive, and sometimes dangerous prospect of trying to get the later evolutions to breed. So, if you are looking for a Pidgey, then you'll easily be able to find one, no problem, whether it be in the wild or in the breeding community. But if you're looking for one of the later evolutions, then you're going to be putting quite a bit of work into getting one. Care. So, let's get through the simple parts of caring for these Pokemon first. Food. From everything that I've said so far, I'm sure that you've gathered by now that the Pidgey line are all carnivorous. You're going to have to either raise your own feeders or order them online for these Pokemon. In all honesty, if you plan on only having one Pidgey evolution and just using the feeders to feed the bird Pokemon, then I would suggest just ordering them online. Especially since the feeder that you'll be giving to your bird will change as it evolves. You can order them in bulk and they come frozen already, so you just throw them in the freezer and only unfreeze what you need. Moving on to what to feed them and how much, for your Pidgey you'll want to order some sort of small bug-type Pokemon, such as Caterpie or Burmy. I would avoid ordering Cutiefly though, you just don't get as much for your money per pound with them. Honestly, the best feeder that I have found is Caterpie. They're plentiful, easy to get hold of, and if you want to raise them yourself, they aren't that hard to care for. Once you get your feeders, you'll give 3 ounces of food to your Pidgey twice a day. Just place it in a dish in its enclosure and it should eat it just fine. When it evolves into a Pidgeotto, though, you'll have to change out the bug Pokemon feeder for a fish Pokemon feeder, which you'll be using for the rest of the evolutions. I would suggest Magikarp, as it's so common in the oceans that you could go fishing for a day and easily catch enough Magikarp to feed your Pokemon for over a week. Once you get the Magikarp fillets, you'll be feeding your Pidgeotto 3 pounds of meat once a day, and your Pidgeot will get 4 pounds of food a day. Same as your Pidgey, just place the fillets in a dish for your Pokemon and place them inside the enclosure. You should have no problems from there. Cleaning wise, you'll have to clean the enclosure out every now and then. Sweep out molted feathers, refill waters, clean up any waste. Just be sure that when you go in to clean out the later evolutions enclosures, they are well trained enough to be okay with you inside their enclosure. If not, then again, it won't be a fun time for you while you're in there trying to clean. And with that segue, we've come to the training. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you here. I have never trained or raised a bird Pokemon before. My parents raised bugs and grass types, and I've just never had a flying type catch my fancy. The closest I've ever come is fending off some smaller P-doves from the Sawaddle enclosure back at home, but I don't really think that counts as caring for them, so that's probably disqualifying. Because of that, I want to be clear that I am in no way an expert on training your bird Pokemon in this way. I've done the research and consulted the few people that I was able to get a hold of that know more than me to understand the basics, so if you do plan on getting one of these Pokemon, I would highly recommend you find and talk to someone that'll be able to better give you lessons on how to work with your bird. With that disclosure firmly in place, let's get into how to train your Pidgey line. The things that you're going to need are going to be a whistle, a perch that is rated to be able to handle a Pidgeot's weight, and bits of food. Mind you, we are going to be working with a Pidgey, but if you get the stand that can support the Pidgeot right away, then you won't have to replace it later on when it evolves. Once you have these 3 items, set the perch up in the room where your Pidgey will be flying around. Take one of the bits of food and place it on the perch, right where you want your Pidgey to land, and take a step away from it. Keep the whistle at the ready, because as the Pokemon jumps or flies to the perch, blow the whistle. After eating, Pidgey will eventually take off from the perch again, after which you're going to repeat the process, blowing the whistle each time the Pidgey takes off to land on the perch. What this does is this starts to associate the sound of the whistle to landing on the perch and receiving food. Oh, and the food you should be using for these should be one of the 2 meals that you'll normally feed your Pidgey. That way, the Pokemon is hungry enough to initiate the training and not being overfed. Once you've done this routine for multiple sessions, do not place the food on the perch when you start the session. Instead, keep the food in one of your hands, and while your Pidgey is flying around the room, blow the whistle. If your Pidgey responds to the whistle and flies to the perch, then give them the food. If they don't, then I want you to shut all the windows and shut off the lights in the room and leave for about an hour. This should fool your Pidgey into thinking that nighttime has come, and they'll return to their enclosure as if getting ready to sleep. This will essentially simulate going to bed with no dinner for the Pidgey, teaching it that ignoring the whistle does have consequences without making it go hungry. After about an hour, return to the room, turn the light back on, and wait for your Pidgey to start flying around again before attempting the whistle again. And so on and so forth. Just keep repeating that pattern. If the Pidgey ignores your whistle 5 times in a row, then it's time to return it to its enclosure, end the session, and this is important, be sure to give it the rest of the food. Not allowing your Pokemon to eat just because they're not listening to you is a very bad practice and not one that I'm going to support on this channel. There are different methods that say you should withhold it as it teaches them consequences, but I just don't agree. After that, the session is over, you're done for the day, you'll just have to come back the next day to start up training again. Just keep up with the training, and while it is going to take some time, and it might not be done very quick, you're probably going to get frustrated, and that's okay. Just keep chugging along. Eventually, your Pidgey will always respond to the whistle, having learned that it's better to listen than to ignore it. Once that happens, start to scale back the reward for responding to the whistle. By keeping to this training routine, you and your Pidgey should get to a point that whenever you blow on that whistle, your Pidgey just returns to the perch without the incentive of a reward. Now, when your Pokemon evolves is when this training is going to be very important. Place the perch that you've been training your Pidgey on near the entrance to the outside of the enclosure. When your Pokemon is flying around outside, you stand by the perch and blow the whistle. Your Pokemon should be near enough to hear the whistle. I know the Pokedex says that Pidgeotto fly over 60 miles to find food, but you have to recognize that it's an old myth. A flight like that would burn more calories than the food was worth, not to mention the effort to carry it back to their nest. And once they hear the whistle, they'll fly back and land on the perch. You can then use a small bit of food to get them to return their enclosure. Again, these are just basic training that you can do with your Pidgey evolution. There are many, many more things that you can work on teaching your Pidgey how to do. But for that, you should consult an expert beyond my skill level to learn how to do it. Cost. The enclosure is where you're going to need to spend a lot of money for these Pokemon. Even Pidgey's enclosure won't be cheap. I think the cheapest you could find one of the right size is in the high category. And the outside enclosure? Oh, you're looking at going deep into the very high category. There's just no avoiding that expense, unfortunately. The integral need for so much room just means that, inherently, the enclosures for flying-type Pokemon are going to be more expensive. Add in the training equipment, the decorations for the inside of the enclosure, and the water dishes, and you'll need to drop some serious money here. The Pokemon, however, could cost you very little. In fact, if you're willing to give it a try, you could go out and catch one fairly easily. At least, Pidgey you could. Pidgey are so common in so many regions that the cost of a Pokeball to catch it could be the only thing you have to pay. Coupled with the fact that breeding Pidgey without including the later evolutions is relatively easy, they've become very common in the breeding industry as well, putting Pidgey at the very low category. The later evolutions, though, are another story. Oh, they could be just the cost of a Pokeball if you happen to find one in the wild and get very lucky, But, like I said earlier, that isn't exactly a common sight. And the late evolutions are such a pain to house together that getting one from a breeder will be more expensive just based on investment and time, bumping the price up to the high category. Food is the middle ground between the two extreme prices of the enclosure and the Pokemon. The two feeders that I recommended, Caterpie and Magikarp, are both plentiful, easy to produce, and can be bought in bulk and frozen. I mean, heck, you could even go to the nearest body of water and catch the Magikarp yourself if you have a rod and a place to do it nearby. But even if you order your food online, as long as you do it in bulk, the price for each month should be in the moderate category, possibly even the high part of the low category if you're catching your own Magikarp. Conclusion. Out of all the types, I think that flying types are the ones that I've considered personally taken care of the least. And the Pidgey line are perfect examples of why. With the territorial nature, the need for abundant space, and the special training, I've always seen them as not worth the investment. But then, I've always looked at them from the perspective of a breeder. Plenty of people find flying-type Pokemon, including the Pidgey line, very fulfilling to raise and work with, or just love to watch them fly through the sky. They find it relaxing or peaceful. But that doesn't erase the reality that the Pokemon are tough to keep and raise. Pidgey I might recommend to someone with minimal experience with bird Pokemon, but Pidgeotto and Pidgeot are for those who are experienced in how to take care of these kinds of Pokemon. And, if that happens to sound like you, then I see no reason why these Pokemon couldn't be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for joining me, and please do so again next time when we cover one of, if not the most common Pokemon from the Kanto region, Rattata and its evolution, Raticate. Have a wonderful night, everyone. There are Pokemon out there that are rare enough that not many people ever see them, and only high-profile trainers are able to get a hold of them. Then, there are those that are so rare as to be near legends. We know they exist, but they only get spotted maybe once every few years. And then there are those that are so common that they scare the crap out of you in your basement at 3 a.m. when you're just trying to clean Booster's puppy bed and they've made a nest out of cardboard and old shoes in the corner. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides. And today we'll be going over what could possibly be the most common Pokemon in the Kanto region, Rattata and its evolution Raticate. For those in the few regions where Rattata are not everywhere, a Rattata is a small, foot-long rodent Pokemon averaging around 8 pounds, with purple fur, large incisor teeth, and a tail that curls in on itself at the end. Its evolution Raticate is significantly larger and heavier, being 2 feet long and weighing usually 41 pounds. Raticate changed out of the purple fur for a yellow sandy-colored fur and a long, furless tail. As I'm sure you imagine based on my description before, Rattata is another Pokemon that is considered a pest Pokemon. They can live just about anywhere, and they will live anywhere, getting into people's homes and new environments very easily. They also multiply very quickly, whole populations exploding into massive size in only a few weeks. Those two things combined are the reason they are so common wherever they're introduced. Small disclaimer before we get into how to care for these Pokemon. The Rattata line are the first Pokemon we're going over that have a regional variant in another region. In the Alola region, Rattata and Raticate have both adapted to the new environment, changing in both body and type from their Cantonian counterparts. As a lot of regional variants are so different from each other that they could pretty much be different Pokemon entirely, Regional variants will get their own videos when I start going into the Pokemon from those regions. So, Alolan regional variants will be covered when we get to Alola, and the same with Galarian variations, and the same with Paldean variations. It will just prevent these guides from becoming way too long and confusing, trying to cover two different kinds of Pokemon with different types and living conditions while calling them the same thing. Knowing that, let's get into how to care for these small rodent Pokemon and figure out if these Pokemon are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. As I said in the intro, these Pokemon could really live anywhere as long as there's food and water. While you might not find them in extreme places like the desert or on the side of a volcano, places like forests, fields, or even towns and cities are perfect environments for them to flourish in. But I highly doubt, and would really not recommend, you'll want to just let your Rattata roam around your house like that, building a nest somewhere in your walls. That's how you end up having electrical problems and getting bit. So, you'll need an enclosure. And with the relatively small size of this Pokemon line, your enclosure could fit inside your house with little difficulty. Kind of like the Pidgey or Caterpie line, you could put the enclosure in a corner of your room and have it not take up too much room. At least for the earlier evolutions of those two that I mentioned. Two things that you need to keep in mind when choosing your enclosure for your Rattata and Raticate are the size of the enclosure and the decorations inside. Space is an important thing in your Pokemon's enclosure because it's a very mobile and active Pokemon. You'll need room for it to wander around the bottom of the cage and vertical height, as plenty of the mouse Pokemon, Rattata included, love to climb. Most enclosures that you can get that are made for rodent Pokemon have metal bars for the sides, which provide perfect handholds for them. Another good thing to keep in mind, there's no such thing as too much space for this species. So you could get your Rattata an enclosure built for Eradicate and never have to worry about space again. But I understand the need for space or to save money. Average length for a Rattata is 1 foot long, so the best dimensions will be at least 2 feet by 2 feet and 3 feet tall. Plenty of room for them to move around on the base and climb up the top. You can even get ones that have like small platforms or ramps so your Pokemon can run up them and just get more space out of its enclosure. Or, if you want instead, you could get an enclosure without the built-in platforms and then get cloth platforms, almost like hammocks, that you could attach to the sides and then hang down. These would function the same as the built-in platforms, allowing your Pokemon to utilize the vertical space of their enclosure more. With those, though, you need to keep an eye on them, as your Pokemon may start to chew on them, leading to damage or even ripping through the straps holding up the hammock. Moving to Raticate, you'll need much more space, pretty much double, with its enclosure being 4 feet squared and about 5 feet tall. Same with Rattata, you can get one with different platforms or install the cloth hammocks that'll act as more space for your Pokemon to move around. Whether you go for the smaller enclosure for your Rattata or just go straight to the larger one, you can get both online or at most Pokemon care shops. They aren't too hard to find. An important part of a Rattata or Raticate's enclosure is the decorations, in large part because of their teeth. Those front 2 teeth of these Pokemon, the large, intimidating incisors that they have, will never stop growing. From the beginning of its life to its end, those teeth will always grow and get longer. This is because those teeth are the main way that a Rattata in the wild defend themselves from predators and get rid of rivals from their territory. While doing so, their teeth often break or chip, so they've developed teeth that'll always grow to replace the broken bits. As these guides are more for the person who's going to be keeping their Pokemon in their homes and not battling with them, your Pokemon won't be breaking or chipping their teeth often enough to keep them under control. This can lead to their teeth becoming too long for their mouth and cause damage and health problems. To prevent that, you'll need to give them something hard to chew on. You can get hard chewable treats from the Pokemon shops that would help with this. You could also get a wooden toy that is specifically made for these kinds of situations, or you could use what they use in the wild and give them a small log. Just be sure to get a few of them to provide stimulation and variation to your Pokemon. Either way, they'll spend much of their time chewing on those objects and wearing down their teeth. A few other things to consider for their enclosure will be a wall-mounted water spigot and a heavy ceramic dish on the floor of the enclosure where you'll put the food when you feed them. Both very important, but easy enough to get a hold of. When looking at Pokemon that'll interact well with the Rattata line, a good thing to keep in mind is that both Rattata and Raticate are prey Pokemon to a lot of different types of Pokemon. Almost all flying types, and plenty of the other types, can consider Rattata and Raticate prey if they're strong enough. Any fully evolved predators I would keep away from your Rattata line unless they are very well trained, and even then it's iffy. Other Rattata evolutions are a fantastic choice to house with them though. After all, they naturally form packs in the wild, and they are a very social Pokemon. Just keep in mind that if you have one Pokemon of each gender housed together and they aren't fixed, you are going to end up with a lot more Rattata after a very short time. There is a reason they are so common after all, and it's because their populations can explode quicker than most. So, if you don't want baby Rattata, then be sure to either get your Pokemon either spayed or neutered, or go with two of the same gender. And if you plan on housing more than one Rattata and Raticate in the same enclosure, just remember to increase the size of the enclosure. I only gave the specifics for one Pokemon. Availability. If you haven't gathered this from the intro, the Rattata line is in the category of so common that it has become what many consider a pest. They can survive in so many environments and their populations grow so quickly that it is very easy to see one in the wild. And if you heard the air quotes that I just put around those words, that's because you don't even need to head out into the woods or out of your own town probably to find one. I'm sure that if you just ask around your town or take a nighttime stroll near empty houses or parks, then you can find a place where you can catch your own Rattata. I would just advise caution because these Pokemon, while not terribly dangerous on their own, live in such large colonies that they can become a danger just by sheer numbers. But the good news is that if you don't want to go out and try and catch your own Rattata or Raticate, then there are many breeders out there who are willing to sell them. After all, Rattata is one of the most common feeders that are used by breeders like me, and many of us have our own colony of Rattata that we use as feeders for the other Pokemon that we raise and actually sell. So, even if you find a breeder and they don't actually have Rattata listed as a Pokemon they usually sell, just ask them. They may have their own colony and might be willing to sell you one or two if you ask nicely. But my point is that if you want a Rattata or even a Raticate, just looking up your nearest breeder or taking a walk around your town near the right spots should be all you need to do. Care. A good mix of foods for your Rattata evolution will be a mix of Chesto berries and Kelpsie berries, as they'll provide a good amount of protein and fiber for your Pokemon's diet. Then mix in some slices of some other berries as well to vary their diet every now and then, and to bolster your Pokemon's immune system. Personally, I would mix in Spellin and corn berries when they're younger, and when your Pokemon gets older and reaches a point where they start to slow down growing, I would swap out the corn berries for the Wapare berry. Those are berries that I use to feed my Pokemon usually, but if you get your Pokemon from a breeder, check with them and see what they've been feeding the Pokemon. Their diet might be different than mine. Doesn't make it wrong, just different. As for the amount to feed them, the few people in the breeding community that I've talked to that raise their own Rattata colonies said that they don't really have an exact measurement that they give their Pokemon, but the general rule that they told me was roughly a handful of sliced berries per Rattata. For when it evolves into a Raticate, you'll up that to 2 handfuls of the same berries, all sliced. All of these feedings will be done once a day. And as the Rattata line are crepuscular, or most active at dawn or dusk, those will be the best times to do this feeding. Either of these times should be fine, as long as you stay regular with it. This will make sure to regulate their sleep schedule around that feeding time. As for cleaning, contrary to popular opinion, the Rattata line are actually very clean Pokemon. They have a bad reputation for being dirty because of how they can be found a lot of times in places people consider dirty, like sewers or in dumps. But a Rattata that's raised in captivity is really very clean. There are basic things that you'll have to do, just like with all other Pokemon though. You'll need to clean the enclosure, like washing out the food bowl, refill the water, change out the dirty newspaper on the bottom of the enclosure with a new one. You'll also need to clip their nails as well. Thankfully, you should be able to just use a human nail clipper for this, but try not to clip the pink part of the nail. That's what's known as the quick, and it will start to bleed if you clip it. If you do, don't worry, it's a minor injury. Just apply some cornstarch to the nail and that'll help clot it and seal it up quickly. Just be aware that it's still going to hurt and your Pokemon may freak out if this happens. The last thing for their care is the enrichment and socialization that they'll need. This can actually be handled by doing a few different things. One is to get them a good assortment of toys and interactable objects in their enclosure. Rattata and Raticate are actually pretty intelligent Pokemon, and can easily become bored with just an empty enclosure, which can lead to them developing destructible behavioral habits like chewing on the side of their enclosure. A good amount of toys will give them something to keep their attention on, and you should every now and then change those toys out for new ones. That way they don't end up becoming bored with those toys in particular. Another way to deal with your Pokemon's boredom is just to play with them. Both of the Rattata line are highly interactive and playful with those that they've formed a bond with. Doing this will reinforce that bond and give your Pokemon a chance to get out of its enclosure and explore a little bit. For those that are worried about getting bit, as long as the Pokemon is used to you and you don't scare it, then you shouldn't have anything to worry about. Just remember that when you pick them up, make sure you don't try to pick them up from the top. It makes them feel like they're under attack from a predator. Instead, do a sort of scooping motion so you kind of pick them up from the belly. It should avoid scaring them, and therefore avoid you getting bit by those ever-lengthening teeth. Cost. Thanks to the widespread availability of these Pokemon, you should not be paying more than in the very low category for them. In fact, they're so relevant in the breeding industry that it might just be cheaper to get one through a breeder than to buy a Pokeball and go out and catch one. It would certainly be less work. So if someone's trying to sell you a Rattata or a Raticate for anything that is beyond the very low category, then I'm sorry to say that they're overcharging you. Unless it's a shiny. Then it'll definitely cost more, but that's a completely different situation. Depending on what size you decide to get, their enclosure could cost you between the low and the high category, depending on the brand that you decide to buy and what decorations and toys you get for your Pokemon. If you get the Raticate enclosure from the start and decide to buy a lot of high-end and big brand decorations, then that could take you into the high category. But at minimum, on a budget, you could end up only spending in the upper low category for a Rattata-sized enclosure. Food is also something that won't cost you much. Due to the fact that you're only giving them a handful of food a day and the fact they eat berries instead of meat, you could mitigate those costs in a few ways. Either you could grow your own, which, depending on where you live and what the climate and weather is like, could cover some or all of your costs. Or you could order the frozen fruit from online, in bulk if you can, and that should only bring your expenses up to the bottom of the moderate category at most. Taking all of these expenses together, Rattata and Raticate might just be the cheapest Pokemon that we've covered so far. Conclusion. Taken as a whole, the Rattata line of Pokemon are great Pokemon to have. They're small compared to a lot of other Pokemon out there, they can be kept in the house, and they don't take a lot of food or effort to take care of. If you're a parent looking for a first Pokemon for your young kid, someone living in an apartment working with limited space, or even someone who wants an easy Pokemon to care for, I would highly recommend getting a Rattata. Though I don't raise them myself, plenty of breeders praise these Pokemon for how easy they are to care for. After all, there's a reason that a lot of beginning trainers in the Kanto region and other regions use Rattata and eventually Raticate. Out of all the Pokemon that we've covered so far in this series, Rattata may just be the most accessible Pokemon by far, and possibly keep that title for a while. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we go over the other common Kanto bird Pokemon, Spearow and its evolution Fearow. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Pokemon, in general, can be kind of tricky to figure out when it comes to how social they are. There are plenty that like to flock together and form large groups in their own territory. But then you'll get the ones that just want to fight everything and defend their own turf with all they have. Spearow sits squarely in the latter category. This little bird will fiercely defend any scrap of land that it considers to be its own. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be going over the small bird Pokemon Spearow and its evolution, the long-flying Pokemon Fearow. They're both originally from the Kanto region, and while not as widespread or common as Pidgey, they have become a fairly common sight across all the other regions. Spearow is a small bird, only averaging a foot tall and weighing in around 4 pounds. They have this wild, spiky look around their head made of brown feathers, but their back is black in color and their wings are red. Really, they have a strange menagerie of colors on them. Fearow loses that mix of colors, instead having a nearly entirely brown body and wings with lighter accents at the tips of the feathers, as well as a red frock that stands up from the top of its head. Also, its beak has become rather long, and it has jumped up in size, now being almost 4 feet tall and 84 pounds. That's a massive jump in just one evolution, and Fearow put the new bulk and size to good use, using their massive wings to keep themselves in the air for long periods of time. Letting them get that exercise is going to be a big part of keeping and raising one of these Pokemon. But we'll get into all of that later on in the care guide. For now, let's see if these bird Pokemon could possibly be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. To be entirely honest, a lot of this care guide will be the same as the Pidgey line, like the enclosures, with how Spearow is the same size and weight as Pidgey, and Fearow, while shorter, is the same weight and, more importantly, has the same wingspan as a Pidgeot. Their space requirements are the exact same. So, if they seem familiar, I'm just going to repeat what I said in the Pidgey care guide. For those who haven't seen that video, something to remember is that bird Pokemon need space to fly. It's a required part of their life cycle, and they need it for the proper physical development of their bodies. But if we were to build enclosures that were large enough for the Pokemon to fly around inside them, then you'd be encasing entire neighborhood blocks instead of your Pokemon's enclosure. Since that is entirely unrealistic outside of a zoo, we'll be describing enclosures that your Pokemon lives in, but they'll need to be let out to be able to fly around and work their wings. And that means training is a large part of the care for your bird Pokemon, which we'll go over later on. The first thing that I want to go over with you is the type of environment that the Spearow line tends to live in when in the wild. Spearow and Fearow can both be found in grassland environments, places that have tall grass that they can both use their feathers to blend into. Well, Fearow blends in, at least. Spearow's red and black might make it stand out a bit more. Either way, they're built for more warm environments, places that get warm summers and mild winters. If you live in a place like that, then you have nothing to worry about. But if you don't, then you'll have to make arrangements to make sure that they're not adversely affected by the cold weather. especially Fearow, since, as you'll see in a bit, they'll be living outdoors, so you may have to make adjustments to your enclosure so that the weather doesn't affect them too much. After all, I'm sure you don't like being stuck outside in a bad rainstorm or snowstorm, and I can guarantee you that these Pokemon don't like it either. Of course, you'll need the basic stuff, like a water dish or spigot, perches to spread around the enclosure for them to sit on, and a feeding dish for their food somewhere in the enclosure. But space is the biggest requirement for bird Pokemon of all kinds. A good rule of thumb when buying an enclosure for a smaller bird Pokemon is that the width and length of it should be at least 1.5 times the wingspan of your bird Pokemon. Based on the average height and weight of a Spearow, you'll most likely get one with a wingspan around 3 feet, meaning you'll have to get an enclosure that is at least 4.5 feet in all dimensions. Almost like the size of a large dresser. That'll be plenty of room for your Spearow to flit around and jump from wall to wall in its enclosure, and basically so it's not just sitting still and cramped into a small space. Oh, and I should mention that you can get these enclosures from most Pokemon shops or even order them from shops online. They're very easy to find. But remember what I said, that the enclosure is only part of these Pokemon's habitat, and that they'll need to be let out to stretch their wings. Now, since you'll also be doing the Pokemon's training, I wouldn't keep your Pokemon outside. Untrained bird Pokemon will just return to the wild like any other Pokemon. But they are much harder to keep contained when training, so they can just fly away. To prevent this, I would suggest keeping the enclosure in a larger room in your house, and to let your Pokemon get the exercise that it needs, I would let it fly and flit around the room, with your supervision, of course. This will give you a safe space to train your Pokemon to return to you without worrying about them flying off back into nature. Of course, I won't tell you how to decorate your house, but whatever room you're letting your Spearow fly around in, I wouldn't put too many breakable things in it, as a small bird flying and flapping around can lead to plenty of broken items. And with how sassy Spearow tend to be in the beginning of their training, I would expect more damage to things than from others, like Pidove or Pidgey. Once your Spearow evolves, it'll be far too large to be let out into your house. After all, a Fearow has a 10-foot wingspan to carry its bulk through the air, and to house that bulk, you're going to need a massive enclosure. One that is way too big to fit inside of all but the biggest houses. Like I said for the Pidgey Care Guide, for larger birds, the 1.5 wingspan rule for the enclosure size kinda doesn't work. It tends to produce enclosures that are a tad too small for them. I would get an enclosure built that's 25 feet by 25 feet on the ground, as well as 20 feet tall. It'll take up a lot of space, but that's what's needed when you have something as big as a Fearow. And that would be just for it to have enough space to live in. You still have to let it out to give it time to fly and exercise. Unfortunately, due to the semi-permanent nature of these enclosures, you won't find them for sale online. You will have to call in a company that'll build the enclosure custom just for you. The good part about this is that they often include everything that you need, from the watering system to the food dish to the nesting area. It's all taken care of when the enclosure is built. And because this enclosure is so big, there'll also be a door on one side of the enclosure, so that you can enter to either feed or interact with your Fearow, or you can let the Fearow out to fly and stretch its wings. The last thing to talk about with the enclosures for these Pokemon is the territorial nature. So far, both of the bird Pokemon species that we've covered have been very territorial, but Pidgey has nothing on Spearow. While the enclosure I've described is only sized for one Pokemon, Spearow evolutions do well when they're paired with each other. Spearow itself are usually found in the wild in large flocks, and Fearow in smaller numbers, but they do still flock together. Usually in flocks ranging from 2 to 6. But, and I want to be very clear on this, they can be extremely aggressive toward other types of Pokemon. You should house nothing but other Spearow line evolutions with them. Any other flying types is an immediate no, as your Fearow and Spearow will see them as competition for the territory. You'll end up having some aerial battles that you should honestly try to avoid, because it could end up with one of your Pokemon getting unnecessarily hurt, and we of course want to avoid that as much as possible. Bug types are also a hard no, as they are the main prey of Spearow and Fearow in the wild, so keeping them together is just a, pardon the pun, recipe to end up losing one of your bug Pokemon. Nobody wants to walk outside and see their Caterpie missing and their Spearow looking suspiciously plump. Electric types are also not a great idea, as if your Spearow picks a fight with them, it could end up getting zapped out of the air before the fight even starts. And grass types are nearly as vulnerable to them as bug types. I could keep going on and on, but I think I made my point. Anything that you house with them will eventually get into a fight with them. Availability. Unlike a lot of other Pokemon lines where the later evolution stages are unavailable either because of the ecological competition between the evolved Pokemon, the difficulty in keeping and breeding them, or because the people that have one simply want to keep it, Fearow is actually readily available. Like I said, in the wild, Spearow form large flocks, larger in the Kanto region than in other regions, but still. So as long as you're in the correct area, you should be able to find one. And since Fearow also form flocks, there isn't as much competition between them as other fully evolved Pokemon, so they can be more abundant in any area they live in. Finding them in the wild isn't too hard to do, as long as you don't live in the Hoenn or the Galar regions. There are currently no wild populations of Spearow or Fearow in those regions. But something to keep in mind is that I don't recommend wild caught with these species. Wild Pokemon can have a territorial streak, and if you get a wild Fearow, I'm just going to wish you good luck. It's very tough, and more importantly, much more dangerous, to try to change a fully evolved Pokemon's behavior than it is to change a young Pokemon's behavior. But the good news on that end is that Spearow is such a common Pokemon that there are plenty of breeders out there that raise and breed them. They can be harder to find than other birds like P-Dove and Talo because of the hours the breeder will need to put in just dealing with the sassy nature of these Pokemon. But to those that are persistent, you'll be able to find a Spearow or even a Fearow from a breeder relatively easily. Care. Honestly, the care for Spearow and Fearow is really like any other normal flying types out there. The only thing with these birds is that I would put in a special emphasis on the training. It is much, much more important to make sure that these birds are trained than almost any other. Well, maybe Talo, but they aren't territorial so much as too brave for their own good. Anyway, back to Spearow. Like I said, the care for this one is nearly the same as any other bird Pokemon's care. But I'll still run through it for those that just came here to find out how to raise a Spearow evolution. Cleaning will be the easiest part of this, so let's talk about that first. You'll have to make sure that the enclosures stay in good, clean condition, which means scrubbing away things like leftover food, droppings, and any other mess that your Pokemon makes. During molting season, and occasionally all year round, feather sweep up will be an important part of it as well. They can get kinda gross if you leave them in the enclosure for too long. Then, at the end, you just refill the water and make sure everything is all set the way that it should be. Food will be a basic thing to handle as well. Spearow and Fearow both are carnivores, so you will need to get some meat feeders. There are two ways that you could go about doing this. One is that you could raise the feeders yourself. This will make things easier for you cost-wise in the long run, but it also isn't for everyone. What many people do instead is that they order their feeders from breeders online and they get a shipment of them frozen. Then, when you go to feed your Pokemon, you just thaw out the amount that you need. In the wild, Spearow eat bug Pokemon, small ones. The best thing to order for them would be Caterpie, since that's what their natural prey is out in the wild. Defrost about 3 or 4 ounces twice a day, one of which will be used in training, which I'll get into in a second. Now, usually, when a species evolves, I would have you swap out what kind of food you feed your Pokemon, like what I did with the Pidgey line. But in the wild, both Spearow and Fearow feed off the same prey, meaning that I would just keep using the Caterpie feeders instead of switching it out for something like Magikarp. Instead, you'll only have to up the amount of food that they get, up to 4 pounds for a fully grown Fearow. It may seem like a lot, which it kinda is, but you have to remember that these are massive Pokemon, and they require a lot of caloric intake to be able to lift and keep themselves in the air. And now, we come to what is probably the most important part of this care guide: training. Granted, the entire thing is important, but with how aggressive this Pokemon species can be, training is the kind of thing that could potentially keep you or your Pokemon from getting injured. Also, let me preface this with the fact that I have never cared for a bird Pokemon myself. I just don't find them terribly interesting, and they require so much investment and training to care for effectively. So, I am by no means an expert in this training method. I did some research online for a couple days and compiled what I believe is an effective training strategy. But if you are serious about getting one of these flying type Pokemon, then I would highly suggest finding and talking to an actual flying type trainer who can give you a proper rundown of a good training regimen. Got it? Okay. Now that the disclaimers are out of the way, let's talk training. You'll need a bit of equipment first before we get started. That will be a Pokemon whistle, some padded clothing and a face mask, one of the 2 meals that I mentioned earlier, and a flying Pokemon perch that's rated to a Fearow's weight. You could get one that'll handle just a Spearow, but in the long run you'll end up needing to replace it with a Fearow stand anyway, so it'll save you money just to buy the Fearow one right away. Now that you have the equipment and your Pokemon, set the stand up in the same room that you'll be housing your Pokemon in. Place one of the bits of food on the perch, release your Spearow to fly around the room, and step back from the enclosure and the perch. Make sure you have the Pokemon whistle at the ready, because as soon as the Pokemon lands on the perch to get the food, give a sharp toot on the whistle. Then wait until your Pokemon takes off from the perch to start flying around the room again, and place another bit of food on the perch. From here, you rinse and repeat. This stage is where the padding clothing and the face mask are going to come into play, unfortunately. Like I've been saying, Spearow is a very territorial species, so when you release it into the room, it might not take too kindly to you being in the room with it. And unfortunately, that means it might start pecking and beating its wings at you. The padded clothing will keep this from injuring you. But this is also why I always recommend having a Pokeball connected to any Pokemon you keep. If your Spearow does start to become overly aggressive towards you, return it to its Pokeball, and then return it to its enclosure. Give it half an hour to calm, and then re-enter the room and try again. The idea is that the Pokemon will eventually become accustomed to you being in the room with it. It's not going to happen right away, but over time it should become more and more comfortable with you being around. It'll just take a lot of patience and a lot of effort. Once your Pokemon becomes more amiable towards you, then keep placing the food on the perch and whistling when it lands to eat the food. Eventually, the Pokemon will start to associate the sound of the whistle with getting food on the perch. After a few weeks, reverse the process. When you let your Pokemon out of their enclosure, don't put the food on the perch. Instead, while your Pokemon is flying around the room, blow the whistle first. If your Pokemon has been conditioned to the sound, then they'll land on the perch, expecting food. And then, if they do this, reward them with said food. If they do not do this, wait a minute, then blow the whistle again. It may take a few blows for them to land on the perch, and that's fine, eventually they'll get better at it. This stage of training is really just to reinforce that conditioning. If you end up blowing the whistle 5 times and your Spearow still ends up ignoring you, then use the Pokeball to return them to the enclosure and shut out all the lights from the room. Close off all the windows, shut off all the lights, and close the door. Then keep it like this for about an hour. Doing this will fool your Spearow into thinking that night has come and, essentially, simulate going to bed without dinner, showing that not listening to the whistle will have consequences. Then, after that hour, return to the room and try the training session again. Keep trying this a couple times, and if they still do not listen after a few times of being sent to bed, then you need to end the training session and leave the room for another hour. This hour acts as almost a buffer zone. That way your Pokemon doesn't associate getting fed with the fact that they didn't listen. Giving it that space separates those two ideas in the Pokemon's mind. Never, ever refuse to feed your Pokemon, even if it's not listening during training. Okay, so as time goes on, and you continue doing the training, then your Spearow should start to respond to the whistle more and more, until it responds and lands on the perch every time. When you get to that point, start scaling back the rewards slowly. That way they don't expect food every time, but still listen to the whistle's commands. This training will also start to strengthen the bond between you and your Pokemon, which is another very important part of your relationship. Eventually, they'll return to the perch without the food reward being needed. Of course, once your Pokemon evolves, then you won't be able to let your Fearow loose in the house, and that's where the training becomes very important. Fearow like to, and need to, take long flights during the day. And of course, those long flights have to happen outside of its enclosure. You'll have to let them fly outside, and that's why the return training is so important. Pokemon that aren't trained to return to their owners tend to just fly off into the wild, and you don't want that. So when your Fearow is out flying around, have that perch that you've been using so far set up near its enclosure. Give it some time to get the exercise that it needs, and then blow the whistle. If you got a good Pokemon whistle, then it should hear it just fine, even if it's high up in the air where they usually tend to glide. Then, thanks to the effort that you've put in while it was still a Spearow, it should return to the perch. Now, like I said, this is a very basic guide to training your flying Pokemon to return to you. There are dozens of different techniques that someone would use to train their Pokemon. So, if this doesn't work for you, that's fine. This is just the way that I saw that seemed to be the easiest to me. Remember to consult with a flying type professional before just going out and getting any flying type Pokemon. Oh, and one last point that I want to mention, always feed your Fearow before you let it fly. That will help to avoid it from hunting while out flying around. The last thing you need is someone upset that your Fearow swooped down out of the sky and gobbled up their kid's first bug Pokemon. It's gonna be a legal nightmare. Cost. A lot of the funds that you're going to be throwing at this Pokemon are going to be tied up in the enclosure. Fearow's enclosure is going to have to be custom built, and even if you build it yourself and don't hire a company to do it, just the materials needed to build it will put you squarely in the very high category. Even just buying the enclosure for Spearow, the smaller one that you can put in your house, it's going to be in the high category. Mix in the training equipment you'll need, and it'll end up being a pretty penny. It's an unfortunate and unavoidable cost of housing a Spearow evolution. Luckily, those high costs from the enclosure are offset by the costs of everything else. The Pokemon itself, for example, will be in the low or even the very low category. I mean, really, you could go out and try to catch one, but I really don't recommend that because of how aggressive they can be. And if an entire flock of these Pokemon comes after you, then you're toast. It would be better if you get one from a breeder, and they're more reliably available from them too. While they may not be as common as something like Pidgey, there's definitely a surplus of them in the Pokemon market at the moment. Even if you want to get a Fearow instead of a Spearow, you can do that. Unlike the later evolutions of Pidgey, Fearow can be housed together without causing problems, so more breeders have them for sale. They even tend to come pre-trained, though if you want a Fearow, then the price will probably jump up to the moderate or possibly even the high category. But that's what you have to consider if you want to spend a bit of extra money for a pre-trained, already evolved Pokemon. I know I wouldn't have the patience to train a flying-type Pokemon like I've already described. The last thing we need to talk about is food. Like I said, for this species, I would recommend Caterpie through both evolutions. That should easily keep the food price in the moderate category. Like I said in earlier episodes, Caterpie are easy to raise, plentiful in many different places around the world, and are sold by thousands of breeders around the world every year. All of this will help keep the price lower for you. Ordering in bulk from wherever you're ordering from will also help keep the price low, as you usually get a discount for ordering that way. Really, you could even start raising your own Caterpie to use as feeders, but I understand that isn't for everyone. Not many people like to just feed a live Pokemon that you've put the energy into raising to another Pokemon that you put the energy into raising. But no matter what you do, the price of your food shouldn't be too much in the long run. Conclusion. Personally, after going through Spearow and how to raise and care for them, I would only recommend these Pokemon for those that are more experienced in raising more stubborn Pokemon. If you're a new Pokemon owner, then I would go for a Pokemon that's more easy to handle. But other than that, I think the Spearow line are great Pokemon. Strong, tenacious, and to those trainers that have earned their trust, they can be very loving and protective. For those that are willing to put in the work to get to that point with one of these Pokemon, then you might just find that they end up being the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all very much for tuning in, and be sure to catch the next episode where we go over the slippery snake Pokemon Ekans and its evolution Arbok. Have a wonderful night, everyone. There are some Pokemon out there that have very bad reputations, and that could be because of many reasons. It could be because of a specific fear that causes people to stay away from them, such as with Ariados and people with arachnophobia. Or it could be because that Pokemon has an unfortunate reputation due to commonly being used by criminal organizations for nefarious purposes, such as Zubat and its evolutions commonly are. And then there are those that you need a permit to house and keep, limiting the people that are even willing to attempt to get one of them. The Ekans evolutionary line unfortunately suffers from all three of these conditions. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, a series where we go through how to house, obtain, and care for different types of Pokemon as if you're going to keep them as a pet in your own home. Today, we'll be going over the snake Pokemon from Kanto, Ekans, and its evolution Arbok. Ekans is a purple snake with yellow eyes, a yellow band around its neck and near its head, a yellow underbelly, and a yellow tail. A fairly simple appearance compared to some of the other Pokemon that we've covered in this series. While there can be a lot of variation based on where you got your Pokemon from and what breeding line you got it from, the average length for an Ekans is 6.5 feet, and they tend to weigh only about 15 pounds. This changes drastically when it evolves into an Arbok, however. While they do get a bit longer, averaging around 11.5 feet long, they actually become 10 times heavier, weighing 144 pounds. A truly massive snake by any standards. You can see how people have a fear associated with these Pokemon. Arbok again has a predominantly purple body, just like its previous evolution, but instead of the yellow underbelly, Arbok instead has an intimidation display on its underside, one that looks terrifyingly like a face, and which it uses extensively in its hunting method, using the scary face pattern to freeze prey with fear and then consume them while they can't run away. A fun fact though, while the colors usually are the same across the entire species, depending on where your Ekans evolved, the pattern on the Arbok's chest will be different. So Arbok that evolve in a certain part of the Kanto region will have a certain pattern, while those that evolve somewhere else in the same region will have something completely different. And those will also be different than those that evolve in another region. It's not important to the care guide overall, but something that I find very fascinating about the species just in general. But that is the basic overview of the Ekans line. Now, let's get into how to care for these Pokemon, and who knows, you might just find that these Pokemon are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. This is probably going to be the most complex part of this guide. These Pokemon have a lot of requirements to be housed correctly outside of a Pokeball. The best enclosure for these Pokemon are going to be slightly different than those we've discussed before. So far, we've done a lot of open enclosures where the Pokemon is kept outside, or the enclosure is partially open where the Pokemon is able to easily get out. That won't be the case with the Ekans line. For these Pokemon, you'll be keeping them in a fully enclosed enclosure that you'll only be taking them out of every now and then to clean and fix anything, such as removing waste and giving them food. Something that you will not be doing often is going into the enclosure to interact directly with your Pokemon. These Pokemon, Ekans and Arbok, are both highly venomous, and, at least Arbok, are usually quick to bite. So unless you really trust your Pokemon, or are somehow immune to venom, you shouldn't be reaching your bare, unprotected hands into these Pokemon's enclosure. I'll get further into the venomous nature of these Pokemon later on in the guide, but I wanted to put that warning here in the enclosure section just to give you a heads up on that. No sticking your digits into the venomous snake home, okay? Okay, let's talk enclosure then. The funny thing with snakes is that while they can be large animals, they don't move around that much unless they're hunting for food. And so, the enclosure doesn't have to be as big as it would have to be for mammals of the same size and weight. That means that the enclosure is going to be smaller than it would have been. Actually, a good rule of thumb is that, for snakes, the length and width of the enclosure should be equal to the length of the snake. So, if the snake stretched out along two sides of the enclosure, then it would be equal in length. That should provide plenty of space for your Pokemon to stretch out and move about throughout its enclosure. Now, that does mean that you could get two different size enclosures, one that is Ekans sized and one that is Arbok sized. But giving an Ekans and Arbok sized enclosure won't hurt, as long as you fill it up with stuff. Snakes, even grassland snakes like Ekans and Arbok, will get very nervous and stressed in their environment if it's just a bunch of open space. They need something to hide under and climb over. That cover gives them a sense of security that is important to their mental health and keeping them happy. When talking about size, your average Arbok is about a dozen feet long, give or take a few inches, which means that the combined length and width of your enclosure should be at least equal to that. Just keep in mind that it's better to have one dimension be longer than the other. If you go with a complete square, then your snake tends to be more on top of itself than you would if you went for the rectangle. Plus, a rectangle makes it much easier to keep inside your house. Another thing you may need to consider when getting an enclosure is vertical space. You won't need much, seeing as Arbok is a wholly ground-dwelling Pokemon. Ekans does spend some time above the ground though, either hunting for bird Pokemon eggs or occasionally sleeping in the branches. So a little bit of vertical space won't go amiss, perhaps a foot or two. Moving from the size of the enclosure, we come to what the enclosure should be made of. You can honestly use multiple kinds of material to build an enclosure for these Pokemon. Each material has its own ups and downs, but it really does come down to personal preference and how much work you want to put in. For example, glass is the most popular material because people can actually look into your Pokemon's enclosure and see it. It's also very easy to clean, and there are a plethora of pre-made glass enclosures out on the market. But glass does have quite a few drawbacks. It's not the best for keeping in heat, which these Pokemon are going to need. Also, with some of the stronger Pokemon like Arbok, regular glass could simply be too weak, and you'll need to either get reinforced glass that's strong enough to contain them, or take the risk of a venomous snake getting loose in your home, which I would not recommend. Out of all the options in the market, I would suggest using a high-grade plastic for the walls, floor, and ceiling, and then using a high-strength glass for the front-facing side and the doors of the enclosure. The plastic is much better at keeping in heat than many of the other materials out there, and is just as easy to clean as glass. It's also more durable, and should be able to handle most things that a Pokemon like Arbok can throw at it. Then, the glass on the front will also give you that viewing window that many people like to have with these Pokemon. A win-win on both counts. Now, I know that seems like a lot, but we still aren't done. The next thing you need to think about are the temperatures on the inside of the enclosure. See, the Ekans line are our first true cold-blooded reptiles. Technically, the Charmander line are reptiles too, but they're fire types and therefore warm-blooded, heated by their own internal fire. Ekans and Arbok have no such internal heat, and therefore need external sources of heat to reliably survive. Out in the wild, this would mean finding a particularly sunny patch of ground or a rock to lay on to soak up the heat being given off by the sun. This helps them with digestion and energy production, among other things, so it's a very important part of their life cycle. But if you're keeping the Pokemon inside of an enclosure in your house, then how are you going to get that sunlight, you ask? Well, you'll need three things. Two of those are a heat mat, which is exactly what it sounds like, a mat with wiring in it that heats up when it's plugged in, and a thermostat that plugs into that heat mat. You will need this to simulate the temperatures that these Pokemon would be living in the wild. You'll also take the mat and place it under one side of the enclosure, which we'll call the warm side from now on. But if you just plug the mat in and leave it, it can end up getting too hot and burning your Pokemon. Most mats don't have a built-in thermometer, so they just heat up to the maximum when they get plugged in. This is where the thermometer that you got comes in. You can plug the mat into the thermometer and then use that to keep the mat at a regular temperature, instead of just letting the mat heat up to the temp of a Magcargo. The temp that you'll be looking for the warm side is around 82 degrees, as that's the average warmth temperature that the Pokemon would encounter in their natural habitat. If you want to, and I do recommend this, you can get a thermometer, either one of the ones that can stick to the side of the enclosure, or one of the handheld ones that scans the temperature where you point it and use that to double check to make sure that the temperature is right where you want it to be. But please keep in mind that only one side is going to be the warm side. The other side is going to be the cooler side without a heating mat. This will allow the Pokemon to escape the heat if they want to and rest in a cooler area. The temperature for the cooler area shouldn't be too cold. You won't be installing an air conditioner in the enclosure or something like that, but you still want the cold end to be around room temperature, near 75 degrees. The third and last piece of equipment that you'll need is a heating lamp. Like I said, basking in the sun is an essential part of these Pokemon's life cycle, but living inside means that their exposure to the sun is going to be limited. Setting up a heat lamp with a UV bulb will be needed for them to develop and grow healthily. Set it up in the warm end of the enclosure and shine the light down from the ceiling. Then I would place a large rock or something else that the Pokemon can climb on top of and rest while sitting in the UV light. And now we get to what is actually inside the enclosure. The real internal details of what your Pokemon's habitat is going to be like. The substrate, which is what everything sits on in the enclosure, should be something utilitarian. Wood shavings are a great choice, as they're very absorbent and easy to clean out when the Pokemon makes its waste. Plus, and this is a big bonus, it's relatively cheap and easy to get. After all, wood is a pretty easy resource to come by. You just have to make sure that you clean and replace it regularly, because if the wood gets too wet, then it can cause problems with the Pokemon's scales. Aside from the substrate, you want to make sure that there are plenty of decorations inside the enclosure itself. You'll need 2 hides, one on the warm side and one on the cool side. Hides are fake cave-like structures that you can buy that your Pokemon can slither under and feel like they're protected inside of it. Kinda like a home inside their enclosure. Of course, you need to make sure they're big enough for the entirety of the Pokemon to fit inside the hide, but also not big enough that it takes up a large amount of the Pokemon's enclosure. And the reason you need two is just so they can either hang out in their hide on the warm side or hide out in their hide on the cool side, depending on how the Pokemon's feeling at any given moment. And last but not least is the enrichment. You see, usually a Pokemon gets enrichment, or mental stimulation, or playtime, or whatever you want to call it, by actually playing with something like a toy or trying to figure out a puzzle that has treats inside of it. Snakes don't really do that. They get enrichment just from moving around and climbing over things and exploring, which is another reason not to leave the enclosure just a bunch of empty space. It'll lead to your Pokemon becoming bored and understimulated. As well, having things that take up some of the space in the enclosure will also keep your Pokemon from feeling stressed out, as with the decor, they'll feel like they are less exposed to predators and things like that. With Ekans, I would use some grass-like plants that are set into the substrate, along with a few branches for it to climb on. Remember that Ekans is a bit of a climbing snake, and will use the vertical space somewhat. Arbok, however, doesn't do any climbing, and therefore I would remove the branches from the enclosure and instead give them some rocks and possibly even half of a hollowed out log that they can slither under. Again, you are really just decorating so that the space isn't a complete empty enclosure. Just be sure that you don't overcrowd your Pokemon's enclosure either. Too much stuff could mean that your Pokemon may have a hard time moving through the enclosure and would cause just as much stress as not having enough decor. It's a very fine balance to strike. Let's see, is there anything else? Oh, yes, the water bowl. Can't believe I didn't mention this before. Of course your Pokemon are going to need a water bowl that they can get their water from. But due to the size and strength of these Pokemon, you're going to want to get one that is very heavy and tough for them to knock over, as well as one that'll hold a decent amount of water for them. Look for something that is made of stone or concrete and place it on the cool end of the enclosure. That way the heat doesn't cause the water to evaporate faster than it should. Then, every few days, either change the water if it's getting gross, or refill it if you see that it's getting low. And a last little note, I always say you should have the enclosure set up before going out and getting the Pokemon, but that is especially true for these Pokemon. Reptiles have so many requirements for their enclosures that other type of Pokemon just don't. If you get the Pokemon and you don't have the enclosure set up beforehand, you'll end up having to keep the Pokemon in suboptimal conditions, and that could lead to the chance of injury to your Pokemon or the chance that it'll escape. And I've said it once, I'll say it again, and I'm gonna keep saying it, you do not want a large venomous snake loose in your house. It will not end well for all involved. Having the enclosure set up beforehand should remove that risk entirely. Availability. So, these Pokemon exist in that strange spot where they aren't rare, but they can be very much a hard Pokemon to get a hold of. And that is mostly due to their venomous nature. While, yes, these Pokemon appear in the wild in multiple different regions, and in almost every environment that they're introduced into, they end up flourishing, it needs to be recognized that due to the highly toxic nature of their venom, just keeping one can be a rightly dangerous task. Keeping more than one, let alone multiple breeding pairs, is a great risk that only a few specific and highly trained people should attempt. Add in the fact that you need a permit to be able to house them legally, and the specific requirements of each enclosure for each Pokemon, and there aren't many breeders who are willing to put in the effort to raise these Pokemon. That's an unfortunate reality of many poison-type Pokemon, I'm afraid. Their presence can be toxic to the people that are taking care of them, so many people aren't willing to try and care for them. Those people are out there, but they are few and far between, which means that if you're going to get your Pokemon from one of them, then it won't be coming cheap. Which I'm sure leads you to the thought of, okay, well then I'll just go out and catch one. They're pretty easy to find in the wild, you said. Do not do that. These Pokemon are very good ambush predators. And while they don't go for humans for food, they can be very hard to spot in the wild until you are right on top of them. And at that point, they may feel threatened enough to strike at you. If that happens, then you will need immediate medical attention. And if you're far enough out in the wilderness, then that can be a real problem. These Pokemon are no joke. There is a reason that they are widely used by criminal organizations. I do not, by any means, recommend you go out trying to catch one of these Pokemon. If you truly don't want to pay the price for a breeder-raised Pokemon, which I still recommend over getting a wild-caught one, then I would hire a professional Pokemon trainer to go out and catch one for you. They have teams of Pokemon that can protect them when they're out in the wild. It will still be expensive, but if you have your heart set on having a wild Pokemon, then that is the route that you should go for. It is safer for you to simply have a professional do it for you. And again, make sure that you have the permit and enclosure set up before the Pokemon gets to your house. Care. Alright, you have your very venomous snake, and the enclosure is set up, and you have the okay from the government that says you are allowed to have that snake. Well, the good news is that caring for these Pokemon can be very easy to deal with, and that's mainly because I recommend very little physical contact with them. For example, let's take the training. Like any Pokemon, you can technically form a bond with and train these Pokemon to follow your commands. Plenty of professional trainers use them on their teams. But this is a very dangerous prospect. These Pokemon can be notoriously cantankerous, and with how potent their venom is, even just one bite could spell disaster. Unless you are a professional trainer, I wouldn't recommend trying to even handle or play with these Pokemon. Hence, training is easy. Don't touch it. The only thing that you should be opening their enclosure for is to take the snake out to clean the enclosure. But even for that, you should have a snake hook, a thick pair of leather gloves, and be using the Pokemon's Pokeball. Trust me, the biggest concern with these Pokemon is getting bit. I cannot overstate that, and you cannot go overboard with the precautions. Back to cleaning, you shouldn't need to do it that often. The main thing that you'll be doing will be changing out the water and changing the substrate. Either of them will get filthy as days go by, mostly from the waste that your Pokemon is producing. The good news is that these Pokemon's metabolisms are so slow that they only eat, and therefore poop, about once a week or so. And one poop won't mean that you're going to need to change the substrate. I would say that every 2 weeks, or possibly even 3 weeks, you'll need to change out the substrate and put in new material. The water, however, should be changed and refilled about once a week. Snakes drink more than they eat, and if it has made a mess in its water bowl by kicking up substrate or waste into the water, then you'll need to change it early. You'll also need to scrub the walls every now and then, as they can get dirty just as time passes, like most things do. And the last thing you'll have to deal with when it comes to cleaning is the shedded skin. A lot of the more reptilian Pokemon actually shed their skin every now and then. Because scales don't expand and grow like skin does, reptiles often need to shed their old scales and let in new, larger ones. It also helps to heal old damaged scales and lets healthier ones come in, which is great for the Pokemon when the new scales come in, but then the older shed skin is just left in the enclosure. Normally, it would just be left in the wild and they wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. But in their enclosure, it'll just sit in the way and become a health hazard as the old skin starts to rot. So once the old skin is shed, you'll need to go into your Pokemon's enclosure and pull that shed skin out. It shouldn't be too often for that, as they only shed about 3 or 4 times a year, but when it happens, you do have to go in and remove it. Speaking of the shed skin, you should keep an eye on your Pokemon when they're starting to shed. You'll be able to tell when this is happening because the color of their scales will start to gray out, and their eyes will look like they're starting to become cloudy. Don't worry, your Pokemon is okay, they're just starting to get ready to shed. After a bit of time, you'll see that the old shed skin will start to flake off and be left behind. This should happen naturally and only take a few days for the old shed skin to come off. Really, the only reason that I'm bringing this up is because occasionally shed skin can get stuck in certain places, like over the eye and around the tail. This can happen when the snake is dehydrated or the air inside the enclosure becomes too dry. If that shed skin is stuck there for too long, then it can end up leading to health problems. Especially if the stuck shed skin is still there when the next shed comes along. It can lead to a buildup of dead skin just sitting there on the body. If this happens, don't worry, there are a few things that you can do. One thing that you can do is provide a slightly damper environment. You can do this using a spray bottle to mist down the environment, or, and this is the way that I would choose to do it, is providing what is known as a humid hide for them. It's a sealed container, one that is large enough for the entire Pokemon to curl inside of. Inside of that container, you want to put a thin layer of something that'll hold water well. Moss is a good natural material that most people use. Then add a good amount of water to it, not enough to where the moss can absorb it all, but enough to where it's wet to the touch. Then cut a hole in the side of the enclosure for your Pokemon to slither through and place it on the warm end of the enclosure. Doing so will allow the inside of the container to become much more humid than the rest of the enclosure. If your Pokemon is dehydrated, then it will naturally seek out this place of higher humidity to correct that issue. Another way to fix the issue of stuck shed skin is to take your Pokemon to a Pokemon Center. The workers there are very knowledgeable, and no matter which Nurse Joy you're dealing with, they are an absolute pleasure. They will sort out your Pokemon no matter what. Just remember to use the Pokeball to transport them to the Pokemon Center. Food is actually very easy to handle for these Pokemon, as long as you don't get squeamish. I mean, Ekans is actually even easier. Ekans is an egg-eating Pokemon. In the wild, they hunt out nests of Pidgey and Spearow in the wild and eat any of their eggs that they find, which makes feeding Ekans extremely easy for you. After all, they sell Spearow and Pidgey eggs in the supermarket. Just grab a carton of their eggs the next time you have to go shopping, and that should cover your Pokemon for a while. Then, to feed your Ekans, you'll need a dish that you can place the eggs on when you're feeding your Pokemon. That way they don't end up eating some substrate that gets stuck to the egg by accident. And when your Ekans gets hungry, then they'll come over and eat the egg. Easy as that. The only extra advice that I'm going to give you is to keep an eye on the egg. Snakes have weird appetites, and Ekans might not eat the egg right away after you put it in their enclosure. If that's the case, then that's okay, but just keep an eye on it and make sure that it doesn't sit there too long that it starts to rot. If it does, then throw it out and replace it with another one. No big deal. Your Ekans will eat it when it gets hungry. Arbok's food is where people tend to get squeamish. When they evolve, Arbok is no longer an egg eater. I mean, it can if it needs to and it can't find any other source of food, but instead it starts to prefer to hunt smaller prey Pokemon. So, you're going to need to change what you feed your Arbok. Instead of the eggs, you'll need to buy frozen, pre-packaged feeder Pokemon. I would recommend Rattata, as they are probably the easiest and cheapest to get a hold of, but if you have a larger Arbok and want to feed them more infrequently, then you could try feeding them something a bit larger, like a Plusle or a Pachirisu. But keep in mind, that's only for the largest of specimens. Rattatas should do just fine for most of the species. Unfortunately, Arbok aren't scavengers, which means you will need to move the food around for them to think about eating it. Of course, you can't do that by hand. That's a good way to get bitten and for your hand to become dinner. Instead, you'll need a feeder hook that you can put the feeder on and then reach that into the enclosure. Move it around, try to act like it's still moving on its own, and that should get your Pokemon to attack and eat it. Now you know why I said that people can get very squeamish when it comes to feeding these Pokemon. The last part of care is going to be other Pokemon that you can house with these ones, and honestly the answer is a 100% no. On everything. Even other Ekans line evolutions. These Pokemon are complete loners and will not get along with any other Pokemon that is in such a confined space. It'll end with the other Pokemon becoming dinner, or a Pokemon battle that'll probably destroy your enclosure. Do not put any other Pokemon with the mini enclosure. It's just a bad idea that won't end well for anyone involved, including you. Cost. I'm not gonna lie to you. This Pokemon is gonna cost you a pretty penny. Every bit of this thing is gonna be expensive. Take the equipment for example. Things such as the snake hook that you'll use to get the Pokemon out of the enclosure, the thick gloves that you'll need to handle the Pokemon when it's out of the enclosure, the feeder hook for feeding them the food, the government permit for these Pokemon just to own them, and then all the setup for the enclosure, you'll easily be in the high or even the very high categories. It won't be as much as having to redo the entire environment like the Charmander line, but it's not going to be as cheap as the Bulbasaur line. And with these Pokemon, that is not one area to cheap out on. You need to be sure that this equipment is in good shape and good repair, and if that means you need to spend a little more in the long run to keep your venomous Pokemon contained, then I'd say that's probably a good trade-off. Now, the Pokemon itself may end up being the most expensive part. Like I said earlier, the quickest way to get one would probably be to hire a professional trainer to go out and catch one for you. But I still say that this should be your secondary option, not your first. Your first option should be getting in contact with a licensed breeder so that you can be sure of the history and health of the Pokemon. But either way, no matter what way you decide to go with, you're going to be paying in the very high category, and that's simply because of the venomous nature of the Pokemon. It makes them dangerous to hunt down in the wild, and very dangerous to breed and raise. So the people that are willing to take on those dangerous jobs are going to charge for the effort that they put in. After all, that's what I would do if I was raising these things. The last things that you're going to be putting out a decent amount of money for will be the things that you constantly need to buy more of. The food, the substrate, and yes, I'm including some emergency antidote in that because it might just save your life with these Pokemon. Monthly, it's all going to be in the low category, possibly very low if you keep your Pokemon as an Ekans and have an Ekans-sized enclosure. Remember that with Arbok's food, you can keep them frozen for quite a while and then only feed them about once a week. So one order should keep you for quite some time. All in all, this is going to be the cheapest part of raising these Pokemon. Conclusion. In my personal professional opinion, these Pokemon should not be handled by anyone other than a few very highly trained and skilled trainers. The government has it right when they put a permit in place to own one of these. If you are new to the Pokemon keeping hobby, or even if you think that you're experienced with Pokemon, I don't recommend trying to handle or get one of these Pokemon. They are dangerous. If you are looking for a reptile Pokemon, then getting a Snivy or a Treecko would be a good bet for you. Really, anything besides these venomous danger noodles. Okay, well, I've given you my warnings and taught you how to care for these Pokemon if you decide you want to try your hand at them. And, who knows, I could be totally wrong, and one of these Pokemon could end up being the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Whew. Next time, let's try something a little less dangerous to your health. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we start talking about the electric mouse Pokemon Pikachu and the others in its evolutionary line. Thank you, and have a wonderful night. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through different Pokemon species and how you can raise them in your own home. I am your resident Pokemon breeder, Carbon. Last time on this show, we covered the venomous and slippery snake Pokemon Ekans and its evolution Arbok. But now, we move on to one of the Pokemon that many people have been waiting for. We are covering the Pikachu line, one of the most popular Pokemon out there. Now, a few things to cover before we dive into this care guide. The first of which is Pichu. This Pokemon, commonly called a baby Pokemon, was not discovered to be part of the Pikachu line until after Pikachu and Raichu had been added to the Cantonian Pokédex. That's because when the Cantonian Pokédex had been compiled, we knew nothing about breeding. So, all of our Pokemon knowledge came from catching Pokemon in the wild. But, in the wild, Pichu is actually very rare, as the parent Pikachu nest won't let them wander far, which also leads to them forming a very strong bond with their parents and other members of the nest, which makes them evolve rather quickly. All of these factors combine to mean that the original researchers of the Cantonian Pokédex had no idea that Pichu even existed. It wasn't until the Johto Pokédex and the final understanding of how to breed Pokemon that we began to really find out that Pichu was even a thing. The same thing happened with others, such as Magby and Smoochum, and a lot of other baby Pokemon that I'm not going to list out. Granted, there still isn't a bunch that we understand about Pokemon breeding, like what leads to a shiny Pokemon, or why every species, no matter the biology, lays eggs, but we at least figured out that baby Pokemon existed. One of my best friends is actually a researcher that is trying to understand more about Pokemon breeding. I met him on the boat from Unova to Sinnoh. His name is Dr. Daniel Aspen, and he spent quite a bit of time helping me set up my breeding ranch while researching the Pokemon that I was breeding. Eventually, he moved on to study other Pokemon elsewhere. I think he's somewhere in the Kalos region, last I heard from him. So, to any of you that are in the Kalos region, if you happen to see a tall man with black hair, glasses, a white lab coat, and who is constantly muttering about the difference between rock Pokemon eggs and ground Pokemon eggs, that's probably him. But all that was to say that while Pichu wasn't discovered until later on in the Pokédex, I will be covering it in this care guide as it is part of the Pokemon's natural life cycle. But I should also say that you should not have a Pichu, for reasons that I will get into later. This intro is already way too long. But onto the second snag of the Pikachu line, Alolan Raichu. For those that are unaware, it was found that Pikachu that spends some time in the Alola region, when exposed to a Thunderstone, actually evolve into a different form of Raichu, what's known as a regional variant. Instead of being a pure electric type, Alolan Raichu actually gains the psychic type. Why this happens, scientists are still unsure about. They think that it could be the food in Alola, the environment, or any number of other things that cause this change in how Raichu looks and behaves. But Alolan Raichu looks and acts so differently from its mainland counterpart that it's pretty much a completely different Pokemon. Which is why I have decided to exclude Alolan Raichu from this care guide. With it being so different, you would have to nearly change around the entire nature of your care for these Pokemon. Plus, it would extend this care guide to a simply unreasonable length. Regional variants will be covered when I get to the appropriate region. Alolan variants will be covered with Alola, Galarian variants will be covered when I get to Galar, and Paldean variants will be covered when I get to Paldea. Now, with those explanations out of the way, let's actually get started on the care guide. This is the line that everyone over the age of 3 is most likely familiar with. They are one of, if not the, most popular Pokemon lines on the planet, and that is largely due to their very friendly and cute nature. For those who have been living under a crustal for their entire lives, here's a quick overview of what a Pikachu line looks like. Pichu is a small, adorable Pokemon that only stands about 1 foot tall and weighs about 4 pounds. It has a large head for its frame, a small, crooked black tail, and small pink circles on its cheek where its developing electrical sacs are housed. Then, when it evolves into a Pikachu, it doesn't get much taller or much heavier, but its body does get more streamlined, losing that oversized head and its tail growing out into a long, yellow, jagged lightning bolt. Then, when Pikachu comes into contact with the Thunderstone and evolves again, is the only really marked difference in size in this evolutionary line. Raichu is twice the size of Pikachu and weighs an average of 66 pounds. Its fur darkens to an orange color, and the cheeks change from red to yellow. But the most marked difference is the tail. It becomes long, thin, and black, almost like a power cable, and at the end is a large lightning bolt-shaped growth. As we'll go into later on in the care section of this guide, we'll show how important that tail really is to a Raichu. These are honestly great Pokemon for a lot of different reasons, but if you're still not sure whether you want this Pokemon yet, then let's go through it and find out if these could possibly be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. This will be the first Pokemon line that we'll be covering where you don't really need an enclosure to house them. The Pikachu line are so well known and renowned for their friendliness and overall good-natured attitudes. Having them loose in your home is really what many people do, and it's probably the best thing you could do. As long as you train them well and give them easy access to the outside, the most you'll have to do is buy some specialized material and equipment for them. And the number one thing that you're going to need to get these Pokemon is rubber insulation. Now, mind, that's mostly going to be for Pichu. Since it has so much trouble controlling its electrical output, it will, a lot of time, let out small electrical bursts by accident. So, you'll need to buy a lot of rubber insulation for your furniture and any electronics that it can get to. You'll need things like caps for the feet of your chairs and tables, rubber covers for your couch and chairs, mats that stick to the bottom foot of any appliance such as your dishwasher or oven, and rubber caps for your electrical outlets. These will provide insulation to avoid shorting out your electricity, destroying your electronics, or setting fire to your furniture. You'll also need to get them a Pokemon bed to sleep on. It's important that you get them one that's rated for electrical type Pokemon because they're insulated to electrical charges. Since the Pikachu line generates much of their electricity while they sleep, you'll need something that can handle stray electrical charges. Then, you'll just need a few more minor things for them. A Pokemon door that they can get to the outside when they need to, food and water dishes, I always recommend the heavy ceramic kind, and a good thick set of rubber gloves for emergencies. Sometimes, when the Pikachu line gets sick or overloaded on electricity, they can start letting out stray shocks unintentionally. And if you need to interact with them while they're like this, then those gloves are going to be a blessing from Arceus. When it comes to the different evolutions, there really isn't any difference in what the separate stages need. Really, it's going to be small things like different sized beds and things like that. When it comes to other Pokemon living with a Pikachu line evolution, we come to the point that I was hinting at in the intro when I talked about why you shouldn't have a Pichu. Pichu and many Pokemon like it are considered baby Pokemon, a special evolutionary stage that only certain Pokemon lines have. We aren't sure why they exist or why baby Pokemon are so different from other first stage evolution Pokemon, but they are very different. What makes a Pokemon a baby Pokemon is the fact that it isn't really able to fully take care of itself if left alone. Using Pichu as an example, it can't really control its electricity very well. It ends up shocking itself, discharging electricity by accident, and its emotions can cause it to start shocking everything around it. To mitigate that, the Pikachu pack will keep Pichu in the nest, teaching them how to more effectively develop its control over electricity. Which leads me to my point, Pichu need other electric types, preferably other Pikachu and Raichu, around to bond and develop their electrical control effectively. Depriving a Pichu of this electrical development by removing it from other electric type Pokemon is harmful to the Pokemon. It can lead to an inability to discharge excess electricity as a Pikachu or Raichu, and that can lead to health problems like lethargy, aggression, infection, and bodily development problems. To make sure a Pichu is healthy and stays that way, you will need at least one or two other electrical Pokemon for it to learn from. Now, the reason that I say you shouldn't have a Pichu is because most people don't have the space, money, time, or whatever to house 2 more Pokemon along with their Pichu. In the past, trainers who didn't do their research got a Pichu because they thought it was cute, and then those Pokemon ended up growing up with health problems due to being unable to control and discharge their electricity. You should really only get a Pichu if you plan on having other electric-type Pokemon living there with them. If that's not going to happen, then you should skip straight to a Pikachu. Plus, I should mention that if you catch a Pichu in the wild, which, good luck even finding one, you'll be removing it from its nest and pack, and if you don't have the proper support network set up for it at home, then you're going to be doing some major emotional harm to that Pokemon as well. Baby Pokemon should never be removed from the wild unless it's in specific circumstances. Luckily, once Pichu evolves into Pikachu, and if you decide to buy a Thunderstone or Raichu, they get a lot simpler. Honestly, Pikachu and Raichu can go into an enclosure with almost any other Pokemon as long as it's not terribly territorial. Like, I wouldn't throw them in with a Tyranitar or something along those lines, but they're usually pretty friendly Pokemon and can really get along with and bond with almost any other. The only thing to remember is that Pikachu is still a prey Pokemon to a lot of larger predators, so do your research and double check that one Pokemon won't try to eat the other. Also, while the electric Pokemon support network isn't as necessary for the later evolutions, they are still rodent Pokemon, and therefore they are very social. If you aren't going to be spending a lot of time with them, playing and training together, then they are going to need other Pokemon to socialize with. They don't need to be other electric-type Pokemon like with Pichu, but they do need something, whether it be you yourself or other Pokemon. Availability. Due to the extreme popularity of this Pokemon line and how easy they are to breed, these Pokemon can be very easy to come across. It's actually easier to find them in the breeding community than in the wild, but they are possible to find anywhere. However, mostly what you will find in both places are Pikachu. Like I said, you shouldn't have a Pichu unless you are qualified and prepared for it. Taking it out of the wild is removing it from its natural support system in its nest, which is very unhealthy for a young Pokemon to go through. Even most breeders won't sell you a Pichu, as they prefer to keep them in their nests, and unless you can prove that you are well equipped and trained to care for and raise a Pichu properly without it developing some health problems, you won't be getting one. Raichu as well will be hard to find if you're looking just for a Raichu. They're very rare in the wild and in captivity because they require a Thunderstone to evolve. Out in the woods and grasslands where wild Pikachu are common, it's very rare for one to find a naturally occurring Thunderstone. And that just leads to a major scarcity. And then when it comes to the breeding circuit, Raichu are rare because it can be expensive to buy evolution items such as Thunderstones. Now, that wouldn't be a problem if Raichu were in high demand, but they aren't as popular as their pre-evolution Pikachu. So it's just more cost-effective to sell Pikachu to people, and then if those people want a Raichu, they'll get a Thunderstone for themselves. Oh, don't get me wrong, there are those Pikachu breeders that do keep a Raichu or two around for those that want them, but you'll have to look pretty hard to find them, and they will end up being more expensive than a Pikachu. But if you really just want a Raichu, then you can find someone out there that is willing to sell you one. Now, I'm sure you have guessed from what I've been saying, but Pikachu is going to be the easiest and cheapest one to get a hold of. These Pokemon can be very easy to find in the wild if you know where to look. While not living in a ton of places, there are populations in almost every region. And in those places, you'll only need to spend a bit of time looking around before you spot a yellow lightning bolt tail sticking up through the grass. But, as always, please be careful if you decide to go Pokemon hunting. These Pokemon have a very acute control over the electricity they give out, and they can cause quite a bit of damage if you get hit by them. And that's why I highly suggest you get one from a breeder. Due to the insane popularity of these Pokemon and the fact that rodent Pokemon breed rather quickly, breeders all over the world have started keeping these Pokemon. And don't get me wrong, they sell. Even with the oversaturation that the market is going through right now, people can still make a decent living off just selling Pikachu. All this is to say that if you decide that having a Pikachu is what you decide you want, then you should have no problems getting one from a breeder or the wild if you put the work in. Care. When it comes to food, the Pikachu line are either very easy to feed or can be a real drain on your wallet, mostly because of their size. Pikachu, and especially Pichu, are so small that they really don't need that much food per day. Based on the average weight and size of a healthy Pokemon, a Pichu should only need about an ounce of food every day, and after evolving, Pikachu wouldn't need that much more than that, needing about 4.5 ounces. This is where I meant that they could be very easy to feed. Only needing to give them a few ounces of food a day means that you won't be spending a bunch of money on the food for them. But Raichu is where the drain on your wallet will come in. Raichu are dense Pokemon. And I don't mean that they aren't smart, I mean that they are physically dense. While they don't usually get much taller than they were as a Pikachu, they get magnitudes heavier with fat reserves and, more importantly, muscle. Now, for all that muscle to function, develop, and heal, you need a lot of energy and a lot of food. A Raichu will need about 3 pounds of food a day. Needing to give a Pokemon 3 pounds of food a day could put a crimp in anyone's budget. So you have to be very sure that you're ready to feed that thick Raichu when you're looking at that Thunderstone in the department store window. As for what you'll be feeding them, these Pokemon are vegetarians, and the best thing for them are berries. You should give them things that are high in sugar content, which will help them with their electricity generation. While, yeah, they are able to absorb electricity from ambient sources like your power outlets, it's better and healthier for them to be able to generate their electricity while they sleep, and the sugar that they get from their diet will help them be able to do that. Some good berries for that would be the mangosteen berry and the palm tree melon, as they're both high in sugar content. You'll need to cut up the mangoes for Pichu, as it can be rather hard for it to chew, but the rest of the evolutions won't need any meal prep at all, really. Pikachu and Raichu both use electricity to sort of cook their food, using it to soften them up before eating them. They're actually decent tasting too if you can train yours enough to blast one for you too. Enrichment and socialization will also be big parts of this Pokemon's care. Like I said earlier, these Pokemon are pack animals, and thrive much better in a healthy social environment. Pichu, of course, needs it from other electric types, preferably other Pikachu and Raichu, so that they can learn effective electrical control. But even Pikachu and Raichu appreciate a decent social circle that they feel comfortable in. It doesn't have to be other electric-type Pokemon like they have to be for Pichu. It can honestly be any Pokemon, or even if you don't have any space for another Pokemon, it can be you. But they will depend on this social circle for a feeling of safety and community, to make the Pokemon feel like it's at home. Keep in mind that they will want to always be around you and play with you if you're the only social connection they have. So you'll need to devote a lot of time to your day of socializing with your Pokemon. Which brings us to their enrichment. In the wild, the way these Pokemon interact with anything new, or play with other Pokemon, or really just interact with a lot of Pokemon, is by giving them small electric shocks. And that play and exploration is an important part of these Pokemon's development as well, so you'll want to get them some rubber toys that they can shock repeatedly without causing damage to the toy. And also, bring them outside on walks as well. This line is usually very well behaved enough that it should be easy to train to be a good walking companion. It'll be good exercise for them, and you, and it will satisfy that need to explore new areas. Cleaning, I'm barely going to mention in this guide. As long as you install the Pokemon door like I said earlier in the guide, and you take the time to housebreak your Pokemon, then you shouldn't have too much of a mess to clean up. Instead, I'd like to talk about your Pokemon's mood. As I've said multiple times through the guide, the Pikachu line is one of the few lines that actually have trouble controlling their elemental abilities. It's not an ingrained natural thing for them. They need to learn it, like how we have to learn how to walk or speak or use the bathroom properly. Because of that, it can be possible for these Pokemon to end up either with a shortage of electricity in their bodies, or with too much of an excess of electricity. This shouldn't be a problem, as these Pokemon can usually regulate their own internal electrical storage. But if they end up getting sick, or they get injured, or they have a bad day, then there could be moments where they don't or can't regulate their electricity very well. In these cases, it'll affect your Pokemon's mood and how they act, so I'm going to give you some pointers on how to recognize when this is happening. With Pichu, it is the most obvious when they're having trouble controlling themselves, but also the most dangerous, as the small shocks that it gives itself by accident will become stronger and more frequent. If this begins to happen, then you need to take your Pichu to the Pokemon Center right away, because if this continues and the shocks end up becoming stronger, it could end up doing some serious damage to your Pokemon. Thankfully, once evolving, the threat of the Pokemon causing damage to itself goes away. Instead, when they have either a lack or an abundance of electrical power stored inside them, a Pikachu will instead become sluggish and tired all the time, as well as sparks may start to fly from its cheeks if it's too much power. This is fine if it doesn't have enough energy, as these Pokemon will usually generate electricity in their sleep. If it's not generating electricity in its sleep, then it could be something to do with either its diet, or it may be sick. Either way, you should take it to the Pokemon Center just to be safe. On the other hand, your Pikachu could be storing too much electricity. If this happens, you'll want to try and coax it into using an electrical move to discharge the excess, whether it be to cook some food for the Pokemon or just to blast a target with electricity. This should be enough to release the elemental pressure that your Pokemon is experiencing. But if this doesn't relieve that pressure, or that pressure returns, then it's time to take a trip to the Pokemon Center. Last is Raichu, and this is the Pokemon that tends to handle this situation the best. Raichu's organs that generate electricity are so powerful that it had to develop a system to specifically discharge the excess electricity that it builds up. The long tail, tip of the lightning bolt shaped organ is that system. The Pokemon will stick the tip of the tail into the ground, like a grounding rod, and let loose any electricity harmless into the ground. But there are times where Raichu could still end up with a surplus of energy. In that case, the Pokemon will become irritable, more prone to acts of aggression and lashing out, which, if it gets worse, will end up being a hazard to you instead of your Raichu. If you notice your Pokemon is starting to act like that, try to get it to use its tail to discharge the electricity that it's built up. If that doesn't work, or if the tail is damaged in some way, then you guessed it, it's off to the Pokemon Center. If you develop good, healthy routines with your Pokemon, then the risk for these kinds of things does go down. But it's always best to know how to handle these kinds of situations when and if they come up. Cost. Surprisingly, at least to me, is that the total cost for these Pokemon really won't be that much. Despite the popularity of these Pokemon, the ease in breeding and raising them makes it so that the cost of buying a Pikachu from a local breeder will be in the low category, possibly even the very low category if the market is especially bad where you are. Combine that with the low or moderate cost of prepping your home for the Pokemon and the low cost of food, and you have an extremely affordable Pokemon. While a Pichu might be less in initial cost, even if you do find a breeder that is willing to sell you one, just the setup itself for that Pokemon would cause the overall price of it to shoot up, mainly because you have to have other electrical Pokemon around it. That could put you anywhere from the very low category to the very high category. It really depends on what species you decide to have with your Pichu. As well, at least, your food cost will be lower, squarely in the very low category. A Raichu will be the one that ends up costing you the most, both upfront and in the long run. Since they're going to push the cost of the Thunderstone onto you, you'll be paying in the high category for these Pokemon from a breeder. And with how much it eats, it will put that in the high category for food as well. In total, for a Raichu, it's going to be in the high or very high category. As I've always said, the higher up an evolution line that you go, the more you're going to have to pay to keep them. Conclusion. If you're looking for a first Pokemon for a younger child while also still being able to trust your kid to the Pokemon's care, then I honestly do recommend one of the Pikachu line. Super friendly, easy to work with, and you can bond with them very easily just through hanging out with them and training them. Amazing companions and just great family pets all around. And the same goes for Raichu too. Friendly, protective, and amazing to have as your childhood Pokemon. They'll form such a strong, supportive bond with anyone that they consider part of their nest. There is just so little negative that I can say about this line, aside from the possibility of electrical sickness. The only sticking point with this entire line is Pichu. While I give only compliments to Pikachu and Raichu as a family Pokemon, Pichu I have to only give negatives. It's far too young, it requires too much responsibility, and it can be hard for even experienced breeders and trainers to raise them. Pichu, and really any baby Pokemon, should only be raised by professionals. But if you avoid the first stage of this line, then I highly recommend getting one for your family, and it could very easily turn out to be the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join me again next time when we cover the desert Pokemon Sandshrew and its evolution Sandslash. Have a wonderful night, everyone.